Shadow Slave. By Guiltythree. Chapter 1201, Battle of the Black Skull, 15. Under the relentless onslaught of rain, blood was being washed off the shattered armor of a beautiful young woman with black hair and vermilion eyes. She swayed, trying to lash out with her cracked sword, but slipped in the mud and fell heavily to one knee. Her breathing was hoarse, and her lips were painted crimson with blood. Mordred looked much worse than his sister. One of his eyes was gone, turning his face into a grotesque mask. So was one of his hands. His armor was on the verge of collapsing into a whirlwind of sparks, and terrible wounds covered his body, revealing flesh and bone. And yet, his expression was calm. "Ah. It hurts. I haven't felt pain like that in a long, long time." He was growing weak because of blood loss, his vision turning blurry. But he was so close to his goal. After long, excruciating years, the first true taste of his revenge was so near. So, Mordred took a step forward, and then another. His sword rose. His hand was firm and unshaken. Morgan looked up at him, and the look in her eyes was sweeter than nectar. Confusion, indignation. And hidden behind them, a hint of fear. N.01N. How? How are you still standing, monster? Mordred smiled. Barely. He was not going to engage in a lengthy conversation with her, not yet. He knew that his sister was just trying to buy time. Using one of the enchantments absorbed by her body, she was trying to heal herself, her wounds were already closing, and she was not bleeding nearly as heavily as she was supposed to. It was not going to save her, though. Morgan might have been able to heal herself, but she couldn't replenish her essence, her focus, and her stamina. She was tired, and that fatigue was only going to get worse. It was going to seep into her bones and into her mind, dooming her. He just had to last a little bit longer than that. His sister gathered what little remained of her strength and dashed forward with a furious growl. Her sword flashed, sharp and cunning, aiming for his neck. Mordred knew that he wouldn't be able to block or evade it, so he didn't. Instead, he just shifted his torso slightly, allowing the sharp edge to cut into his clavicle instead of his neck, endured the blinding flash of pain, and drove his own sword into a crack in her armor. Morgan groaned. Before she could do anything, he swung the bloodied stump of his right hand, hitting her in the temple with the torn edge of the steel vambrace. His sister was thrown back, dazed. Mordred felt a bit lightheaded, too. A long sigh escaped from his lips. Ah. Through the veil of rain covering the battlefield, he could see what was happening around them. Clan Song was losing. The titanic worm was battered and mutilated, but 3 out of the 4 of his reflections had already been destroyed. The last one, the one wearing Whispering Blade's face, was not going to last much longer, either. Saint Matic himself was close to prevailing in his harrowing battle against Beastmaster. Silent Stalker and Summer Night were still fighting, both stubbornly refusing to admit defeat. At this rate, both of them would perish, and even if the taciturn daughter of Kisong prevailed, she wouldn't be able to continue participating in the battle. Even the reflection of Sir Gilead seemed to be failing against one of Nether's children that Sunless had somehow made his. The scoundrel himself, meanwhile. Mordred felt the desire to raise an eyebrow, but he was too weak and tired to do that. Dire Fong is dead. Sunless and the Dream Spawn killed a saint. This was a terrible, disastrous piece of news, but he couldn't help but feel impressed. Good for them. Morgan tried to stand up, and he pushed her into the mud again with a cruel strike of his sword. There was more pain, and it was suddenly hard for him to keep balance. By now, their clash looked nothing like a noble duel between 2 royal descendants. It was simply a brutal, graceless, vicious brawl. But Mordred liked it more that way. It was much more sincere. Much more honest. Why would murder look pretty when it was so ugly? His sister was still refusing to give up. They clashed several more times, and each time, Mordred was on the losing end of the exchange, until he wasn't. At some point, somehow, almost unexplainably, he gained the initiative in this abhorrent dance of theirs. And once he did, his advantage grew like an avalanche. No matter how many wounds he had accumulated, no matter how terribly Morgan hurt him, Mordred was unshaken. His one remaining eye glimmered, reflecting her dwindling confidence. And then, after a while, Morgan fell and failed to stand up again. Certainly. Here's the continuation of the text formatted like a web novel. Growling, she struck the ground with her fist. I don't understand. How? Are you? What trick? He smiled, dragging his aching body toward her. Now was the time to talk, not only because Morgan had finally exhausted all her monstrous reserves, but also because he was tired, as well. He needed a few moments to catch his breath and prepare for the final strike. You don't understand. Oh, but it is so simple. There is no trick. Yes, you are stronger than me, faster than me. You are maybe even more skilled than me. However, dear sister, I am infinitely superior to you in one aspect. The most important aspect. He struggled against the weight of his sword, which was suddenly unbearable, and gritted his teeth. It's desire. Don't you know that everything has its beginnings in desire? And my desire, it's infinitely more powerful than yours. That is why I am more powerful than you. That is all there is, sister. Oh, and my desire is also much more pure. Can't she see? Well. She's young, after all. Mordred reached the spot where Morgan was trying to get up from the mud and ruthlessly kicked her in the side with his armored boot. She yelped, and fell back down. He looked at her coldly. You see. My only desire is to kill you. But you want so many things. You want to kill and imprison me, but you also want to survive killing and imprisoning me. You want to protect your neck from being cut, your heart from being pierced, your skull from being crushed, your eyes from being gouged out. All these countless desires weigh you down. They are a burden that reduces your strength, dulls your skill, and diminishes your speed. But me. I have no such burden. I only care about one thing. I only want to kill you. That is why you are weak, and I am strong. Mordred used his one remaining eye to glance at the bloody stump of his right hand, at his broken armor, and at his mangled body. His gaze was indifferent. And that is why my wish will come true, but yours will not. Without wasting any more time, he smiled bitterly, and raised his sword. His goal was so close. He just had to bring the sword down. However, he never did. Chapter 1202, Battle of the Black Skull, 16. Somewhere else on the battlefield, a sword made of pure darkness pierced a figure made of blinding sunshine. The radiant knight staggered, while the tenebrous knight stood calmly, looking at him with two indifferent crimson eyes. Saint twisted her sword, and the darkness contained within it seemed to expand, hungrily devouring the shine of her enemy. The reflection of summer night grew dimmer and convulsed, as if trying to scream. However, no scream could be heard. The radiant figure grew bleak and translucent. A moment later, a net of cracks suddenly appeared on the surface of the dying light, and then, with a faint sound of breaking mirrors, the reflection exploded into countless shards of silver glass. Saint indifferently retracted her sword and shifted her gaze, searching for a new opponent. Separated from her by a vast distance, a gargantuan worm brought its monstrous weight down and then twisted, catching something invisible in its maw. The countless creatures comprising the echo slithered, grinding the invisible foe into dust. In the heart of the battlefield, obscured by rain, a beautiful demoness screamed as her face was cut by an unseen blade. She staggered back and fell, crimson tears rolling to the ground. In front of her, a vague silhouette was suddenly outlined by the streams of falling water and the brilliance of flashing lightning. A cold, ruthless voice came from the rain, "Stupid girl. You should have stayed sweet and innocent, like you were before." Beastmaster gritted her teeth. I'm not done yet, old man. You haven't won yet. The rain laughed. Die, now. This little scuffle of ours was fun. You have slain a transcendent human, Dire Fong. Your shadow grows stronger. You have received. The towering monstrosity swayed, the spark of life disappearing from his eyes. Sunny, who had driven the sin of solace into the saint's skull up to the hilt, was perched precariously on the beast's snout, holding onto the gray fur with one hand. He froze for a moment. I won. The body of Dire Fong tilted, and then toppled. Since the saint's transcendent form was quite high, there was considerable distance to the ground. Sunny rode it all the way down, still holding on to the hilt of the sin of solace. The giant beast crashed, causing the ground to tremble. Still in shock, Sunny retrieved his sword and stood up, glancing at the battlefield from atop the felled giant. I won. Then, he lost his footing and rolled into the mud. The mud felt cool and pleasant to the touch. Behind him, the massive carcass rippled and shrunk, slowly turning into the corpse of a man. Sunny lingered for a few moments, trying to comprehend the fact that he, lost from light, had really slain a saint. It was so strange. He could still vividly remember the day when the Night Temple had been destroyed. Back then, the appearance of Saint Cormac had filled his heart with indescribable dread. The following battle between Cormac and Skytide was even more terrifying. He felt like an ant that had gotten stuck in the middle of a clash between two gods. The entire island had been destroyed by their ferocious battle. It all had seemed apocalyptic. And now, Sunny had killed a similar being himself. He had killed a saint with his own two hands in combat. Of course, he didn't do it alone. Nephi's. Suddenly startled, Sunny jumped to his feet and dashed to the spot where he had seen her last. She was still there, struggling to stand up. Her helmet was gone, and he could see drops of blood falling from her ears, her nose, and even her eyes. Her face was pale, with damp hair sticking to it in thin strands. Neph. He slid on the mud and fell to his knees near her, placing his hands on her shoulders. She let out a raspy breath, and then shakily rose to her feet with his help. Sunny felt the warmth of the white flame flowing from his body into hers. Slowly, her skin ignited with radiance, and wisps of white flame escaped from beneath it. The scratches on her face disappeared, and the streaks of blood evaporated, leaving it pale and pristine. A pained groan escaped from her lips, and Nephi swayed. He supported her. She remained silent for a bit, trying to contain the pain, and then asked, "We won." Sunny let out a relieved sigh. "Yeah. He's dead." She winced. "Good." He wanted to laugh. "Good? Good. That's all you have to say." Nephi's looked at him for a few moments. Her face was too close, but Sunny didn't mind. Then, a corner of her mouth slightly curled up. Why make a fuss? It was just a saint. He stared at her, feeling a sense of triumph flood his heart. But then, the smile slowly disappeared from Sunny's face. Separated from them by the wicked havoc of the battle, a blind girl was standing in the middle of a vast circle of corpses, drops of blood falling from her rapier and her armor. Behind her, a woman with golden hair and amber eyes was leaning heavily on a spear. Suddenly, the blind girl shivered and lowered her sword. Her shoulders fell. Turning around, she ignored the rushing enemies and looked up, at the cloud-ridden sky. Her exquisitely beautiful face was solemn. Mordred raised his sword, ready to strike his sister down. But then, he froze. His strange, mirror-like eyes trembled. As if forgetting about Morgan, he slowly turned around and looked at the sky with a grim expression. The smile slowly disappeared from Sunny's lips. The wind was cold. In the flash of lightning, he suddenly looked paler than a ghost. His face fell. Nephi's frowned. "Sunny. What's wrong?" He looked frightened. Without answering, Sunny slowly turned away from her and looked up with an expression of utter terror. I don't know. Something is wrong." His voice drowned in a deafening thunderclap. Neph hesitated for a moment, then traced his gaze and looked up at the sky. There didn't seem to be anything there. Except for a strange, rippling darkness. For a few moments, the battlefield seemed to grow still. And then, the sky crumbled and split apart, devoured by an abyssal rift that seemed to be leading to the very depths of hell. A gargantuan nightmare gate tore the world into pieces, dwarfing the battlefield as it cut through the sky and manifested itself into existence.